my part today is going to be the role of the pediatrician. I'll be able to interject general pediatric and AAP kind of guidelines to answer any questions you might have. But today we are focused on parenting. And so I want to highlight the fact that the pediatrician is a great resource for you when it comes to questions about parenting in general. But when I don't know the answer, I turf quickly to a great resource that we have in our office, but that are also available in the community. And Diana is part of our practice, Kids Plus Pediatrics, but she also has a private practice as well. And so to recognize that in addition to the teacher or pastor, your pediatrician is a great resource and has some great tools available. But once again, if they can't answer the question, it's great to know a resource like Diana.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, it's good. What I would like to do is spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the framework that we look at child development and the stages of development, and then spend a little bit of time talking about parenthood and some of the sort of ways to think about that job or in that role. But then what I'd like to do is use your questions to kind of bring those two pieces together. So I know this isn't a little small roundtable group, it's a great big group. So I'm not quite sure how the flow of questions will go and how specific we can get about things. But what makes it come alive much more than hearing me prattle on and on is to hear your all's experiences, your concerns, where you feel a little bit stuck, what you'd like some help thinking about. So if you can generate some questions, I think it would make it more fun and more interesting, certainly for you guys and for us as well. How many of you have infants? I just sort of want to get a sense of where, okay, who's got toddlers? Nice, nice. Who's got preschoolers? Whose job it is to be bossy. Am I right? They are the bossiest children you have ever met. How about school-age kids? And is everybody back in school? Has everybody sort of made that transition? Great. Teenagers? You're still here. Excellent, excellent.
So we can see you raising your hands too.
Yes, oh, thank you. Anybody launched to college? Anybody sent any kids out of the nest? Oh, great. I'll take consult with you later. I just sent mine up to Chicago. I'm still a little weak in the knees from it. Okay, what I want to think about for just a second with you is sort of the traditional model for understanding child development. And we always start with looking at a age stage, so like infancy, and then embedded in that stage what are some of the tasks that infants or toddlers or preschoolers are trying to accomplish. So for infancy, it's pretty standard, right? We're trying to help those kids get neurologically regulated, which is code for teaching them how to eat and sleep on our schedule. And we're also teaching them about the world. We're helping them learn to trust us specifically, but the world in general. That people come when I cry, that I'm important enough to get my needs met, that I can tolerate a little frustration when my bottle isn't warmed up quite when I want it. So those very early months are all about sort of developing a trust with the outside world and about getting regulated, trying to get into a rhythm that fits the family unit. Toddlerhood, right, is all of a sudden this upright person is taking unbelievable joy in their ability to be mobile, right? Unbelievable joy. On the chair, off the chair, on the chair, off the chair, in the basket, out of the basket, in the basket, out of the basket. You can just watch them in any space. It's just like this, right? And then they just go back, and then they just go back and get it again. So you have to imagine the absolute joy in doing it just because they can. At this age, they're really pushing the boundaries, right? They haven't quite figured out where your buttons are yet. That'll come later. But they are really pushing the boundaries. Very often families will say to me, you know, my 18-month really knows the word no, but they do it anyway. And I would say that toddler doesn't really understand the concept of no, but what they do understand is if they have this small item and they're taking it towards the electric plug like this, they can watch you get closer and closer and closer until all of a sudden you're leaping over the couch to get to them. It's a game of engagement more than it's a game of control and manipulation, right? So don't be fooled into thinking that you're, just because they slow down and they look at you, that they really understand the word no. Mostly what they understand is this sort of great vibe starts to happen if they go and do it anyway.
It doesn't mean they're possessed or anything, for sure. I mean, I know several people ask me that.
Right, exactly, right. This is when often we see a lot of biting and scratching and things like that going on. And this is sort of the very beginning stages of when our children can embarrass us tremendously. Right? It's sort of the beginning of a lot of years, for those of you who have teenagers well know. And it's you know, biting is one of those things where it looks like kids know what they're doing, but they really aren't. They're still doing it, A, because it feels good, B, because little Johnny was in his way, and also because it creates this sort of excitement in the environment again. It's sort of like putting your finger in the light socket. So then we move on to preschoolers, which I said initially is bossy like it's their job. I don't know why girls tend to look a little bossier than boys at this stage, but they do seem to be. They're amazing developmental swings for preschoolers, right? How many of you have 3-year-olds that use the word actually? Yeah, I mean, you're just like blown away. It's like, what? Well, actually, Mom, the weather is... So they use these very grown-up words, but they also, 10 minutes later, can't pick up their own socks. It's like, I can't get up the stairs, right? So on the one hand, you think you're dealing with this 35-year-old, and then 2 seconds later, you've got this kid that can't even get their socks so you can get out the door to get to school. Language-wise, not only are they using the word actually, but they really are great company. They can carry on long conversations. They can tell you unbelievable stories. And they can trick you sometimes into thinking they understand things better than they do. They're still very concrete thinkers. So just because they use the word actually and can tell you about a whole Disney story that they saw, they're still very concrete thinkers, and we have to be very concrete with them when we're explaining things. You're still able to convince a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old who's gotten scared of the dark and monsters that if you put a sign on the door that says no monsters, that'll take care of it.
It does.
It really can work, right? It's like, how does that work? But it works. And that's because cognitively, they're still in a very concrete thinking place. Fears all of a sudden get big for preschoolers. Kids who could sleep in the dark, wander around the house, all of a sudden are scared of all kinds of things. Thunderstorms, the dark, monsters, clinging onto your leg. Very gregarious kids who you think are going to have a wonderful time at preschool. Suddenly you're like, putting on the brakes and not wanting to go. It's also the beginning of a new stage of parenting where you make deals with them and you think it's actually going to work. Right? So you say to your 3-year-old who says, I want to finish watching my show, and you say, okay, if you promise when the show's over that you'll get your shoes and socks on so we can go. Oh, they are all about the promise, right? The show is over, and they are so not following through on their end of the promise at all. And then we get very frustrated, and we get a little worried. We think, oh, our child doesn't, is going to be a liar. He doesn't tell the truth. But you promised. And they're like, what? All I had to do was say yes, and I could watch my television show. What? Promise schmamish. It means nothing to them. But this is sort of the classic, well, I'll buy that for you if you promise you'll do. Forget about the promises. All right, so then we move on to the school-age years. And for any of you, all of you who have just sort of gotten your kids launched off into elementary school in the beginning of middle school years, know that this is a really interesting kind of time developmentally. There don't seem to be quite as many rapid-fire changes going on. And yet one of the biggest changes is that suddenly as a parent, you're in collaboration with the outside world in raising your child. And that's a pretty big step, right? You're suddenly really working with these teachers, trying to figure out what your kids' strengths are, what their vulnerabilities are, and can be very stirring for all of us. Our own relationship with school can suddenly really get going. I don't know if any of you have been called in for a conference lately, but it's pretty intimidating to go. You feel like you're right back in about 8 years old yourself, going into the principal's office, waiting for the bad news to be delivered. So it can be a very dynamic time for kids, but it's also a real shift in the family dynamic. The other big thing that's, of course, happening for school-age kids is friends, right? And suddenly you're trying to figure out, do I go bust the chops of the bully that made fun of my kid at school, or do I lay low and let the school take care of it? Do I go in and raise heck with the principal about something, or do I let the school do it? So it's sort of a really new kind of collaboration. And as you watch your kids go through this, and you know they're going to have good days and bad days, it can be very stirring for us as parents. And then we move into preteen and teenage years, and don't call me, call Todd, call somebody else. I am like not an expert. The interesting thing I think about teenagers is that it can feel very much like the toddlers, right, who are pushing the boundaries, but they're big and they're hairy and they think they know everything, and it's a little bit scary, because they've got adult problems that are happening instead of just hanging onto his suspenders as they're running in space and you're keeping them from getting hit by the bus. You see your kids getting in cars and having relationships with people that you wouldn't necessarily have chosen as the people you would like your kids to hang out with. So in that situation, what happens is that our anxiety gets high, right, because we're worried. And the trouble with anxiety, we'll spend a little more time about it later, is that it's very constricting. We're not very creative when we're really anxious. We hear ourselves saying things like, because I said so, right? Well, try it all you like, you know. Doesn't always work very well. But that's the really tricky thing about teenagers. They developmentally, there's a fair amount of science that says their brain is not nearly as developed as they think it is. But they're all about asserting themselves and pushing the envelope and trying to figure out what's the same and what's different. How are they like you and how are they different than you? So that's sort of a really cursory, I mean, there have been about 50 billion words written about these stages of development, and I've just done it in about 2 minutes. But